In this episode of Idea City,
Cash, of course, is the currency of crime, and if you get rid of high-value banknotes, right away you make work so much harder. You make business so much harder for the drug dealers of the world, and really of any criminal enterprise.
also featured in this episode,
The perfect oyster, where I'm constantly trying to grow it, I'm trying to market it, I'm trying to shuck it, and it requires that you give it that extra care. It requires that you give it that extra love.
Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
Well, if money is possibly the root of all evil, maybe one answer is to get rid of it.
In the first year of the 21st century, a man standing by a highway in the middle of America pulled from his pocket his life savings, $30, laid it inside a phone booth, and walked away. You know, I've known Daniel for 20 years before he gave up money. And then when he did give it up about 10 years ago, I heard about it and I just figured he was crazy. He said that money was an illusion, and I didn't really believe that. In 2008, though, after the economy collapsed and money just disappeared that we thought we had, I started to give him a second look, and I wondered, well, maybe he had a point, because if your house was worth $500,000 one day and then only $300,000 the next day, what happened to that $200,000? What was that money in the first place? Public debt soared to $8, $10, finally $13 trillion. He did not pay taxes or accept food stamps, welfare, or any other form of government handout. Instead, he set up house in caves in the Utah Canyonlands, where he forages mulberries and wild onions, scavenges roadkill raccoons and squirrels, pulls expired groceries from dumpsters, and is often fed by friends and strangers. He writes, "My philosophy is to use only what is freely given or discarded and what is already present and already running." And that's what drew me to Daniel, was here was someone who's saying, you know, maybe I don't know what the solution is, but I'm going to disobey. So basically all three of these movements, left, right, and center, have come to the conclusion that our financial system is a big problem. It's so big that we can't control it, and in so many ways we feel enslaved by it. Worse, we feel powerless to change it. And then Daniel comes along and says, hey, you don't have to be part of the system. I've proven it. I've proven that you can survive and live abundantly for 12 years without using any money. And that just blows people away, and it inspires them, and it inspired me, which is the reason I wrote this book. The fact is, if everyone lived like the average American, the world would actually collapse much more quickly than if everyone lived like Suelo. But when Suelo comes along, why do we all say, hey, if everyone lived like you, this wouldn't work?
We can cultivate freely giving and freely receiving no matter what station of life we're in. That's our true nature. It exists in everybody.
This is a book about a guy that chose to live like a myth. You know, he chose to live like the heroes of the Bible. And that interests me. And of course, the desert is the perfect place for that, because that's where religions are born. You know, I think for Daniel, the story has already sort of ended. I mean, he found a way to live that was meaningful, that he felt like he could live according to his heart and his beliefs, and he could find happiness. But he's not just sitting there on a hill becoming enlightened. He's really engaged with the world, and he wants to get his message across. You know, he says he doesn't imagine everyone going to live in a cave, but he does imagine that money will become obsolete.
So Daniel felt that money is an illusion, and David knows that money is an illusion, right? This is David Wolman.
A monetary revolution is absolutely afoot, and it is really exciting. And yes, it's worrisome in certain regards, especially when it comes to privacy, for example. And no, we can't get rid of cash tomorrow. But the way to think about this monetary revolution is kind of three broad categories. The first is enthusiasm and really innovation in the space of alternative and virtual currencies. And these alternative currencies are being born, and they're being born for a number of different reasons. Some has to do with economics equivalent to the eat local ethos. I want to keep money here in my community. I don't want to log on to Amazon.com, buy a blender made in China that's shipped to me by UPS. I want to buy something from the local merchant and keep money here. But you're also seeing a lot of excitement in this area, especially online, from people who have great anxiety about really the stewardship of national currencies. So there's no question that cash has its hooks in us, and yet we are seeing gradually this rising tide of criticism toward cash as a form of money.
Get the latest Idealist news, presenter information, and watch streaming video at ideacityonline.com. Moses Neimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
Prong number two is what I would call a more honest accounting of the costs of cash. Cash can be very convenient, very quick, and rather safe. If we go to dinner tonight and you cover the bill and then I take out a few banknotes to reimburse you for my half, that's that. It was good. But banknotes and coins have this huge backstory, and they're rather cumbersome and expensive. And it goes well beyond just the cost of manufacturing this stuff. Cash, of course, is the currency of crime, and if you get rid of high-value banknotes, right away you make work so much harder. You make business so much harder for the drug dealers of the world, and really of any criminal enterprise. In the book, I also talk about a report put out by some top brass at the Pentagon, talking about the costs of greenbacks, or really any well-respected currency out there, circulating in the theater of war, especially Iraq and Afghanistan. Piles of cash, these plane loads full of cash, are expensive to deliver, expensive to secure. Troops need them on the front line to buy water or sandbags or information, and yet they come back to haunt us. Because if you are a bad guy out there and you want to purchase some illicit materials with which to do harm to NATO forces, nothing is better than the US $100 bill. So the Pentagon wants to get rid of cash. In the United States, we had 10,000 bank robberies in the US in 2009, 2010. So as a taxpayer now, I have to pay for law enforcement to go after those crooks, and prosecution and incarceration, PTSD therapy for the bank employees, and on down the chain. And it's something of an uphill battle. Why? Because we love cash. I mean, from the day you lost that first tooth and felt that coin under your pillow, you love this stuff. It has its hooks in you in ways that behavioral economists and psychologists can unpack for you quite easily. And these biases really affect our spending behavior. So there's no question that cash has its hooks in us, and yet we are seeing gradually this rising tide of criticism toward cash as a form of money. The last area, really, of the revolution, of course, is new technologies, and especially the phone, when really it is this do-everything tool. From whether it's Apple or Square or iZettle, these are all technologies or companies that you're hearing about. They all see how expensive it is to be transacting with money in its current form, and they all want to take a bite out of those middleman costs and make your financial life more friction-free. As a final note, really, that the need for these technologists, not necessarily to help us part with our funds more easily, but actually help us control our spending more. The kind of Weight Watchers equivalent to the mobile money tools. Because I might need some blockers, because that bias for the $100 bill in my wallet, I just don't want to break it. The physical object has real power over me. And electronic money, everybody knows, swiping is just so dangerous. And so I think for the technologists out there, this is a real opportunity for development. Will we get rid of cash in 4 or 5 years? Of course not. But I think you're kidding yourself if you think that 25 years from now, you can confidently predict what we can and what we can't do with technology. And I think that soon enough, cash will really be as anachronistic as the payphone. Thank you.
So here's another little nightmare to add to your growing list. You know, it's one thing to lose your cell phone, your smartphone, but what if you lose your wallet? What do I do
I don't
then?
even care. That's the trick,
My
right?
wallet,
That's the
right?
hurdle.
This
But,
is my wallet.
you know, a generation or two ago, people were so worried about putting radios in automobiles. They thought this would be the carnage on the highways. You can't do this. And this is our tradition, right? Skepticism about new technologies. And we should be skeptical. But we also warm to them. And once people see the value. So I think once the tools are providing that kind of equivalent benefit for those of us in wealthy countries, people will jump in.
I understand that, but it will still be an enormous pain in the butt when you lose your phone. Thanks very much,
Thank you.
David. Here we go. Yeah, we got to get our picture.
The oyster is a strange creature. It's unlike a fish. It has a huge heart. It doesn't have eyes. It doesn't look back at you. It doesn't struggle when you shuck it. But the one thing that it does demand of you is that you care about the oyster.
Get the latest Idea City news instantly. Follow us on Twitter. Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
So when I found myself on Cortez, I thought this was my opportunity. I would have an intense hour of calm. So I got up early and with the sunrise began to walk the beach. And if you've been anywhere along the BC coast, you know it's unspeakably beautiful and in some parts kind of a little desolate and empty and untouched of humanity, and the vistas are almost endless. And as the sun was coming up and kind of a mist formed, I suddenly noticed in the distance this kind of figure. It seemed a little like a mirage heading towards me, and for a second I thought I was in a Sergio Leone movie, and that the man with no name was going to come at me, and indeed he kept coming. And this figure kept coming, and then purposefully, you know, I looked around behind me to see if there might be someone else, and it was clear that he was heading my way. And then as he got close to me, I stopped, I looked at him. He seemed like an apparition, and he said, "I'm the oyster man." I'm not making this up. He said, "I'm the oyster man," and pulled out a kind of platter with a whole bunch of oysters. He had a shucking knife. And then out of his knapsack out came a bottle of champagne. Chilled. Pretty good vintage. Well, it's like, I don't know, 5 in the morning, and I'm all alone. I didn't know what to expect. And that's when I met Brent Petkau. He's here to recruit you.
Good afternoon. The oyster for me, it leads me to discussion, it leads me to contemplation, it leads me to sensual delight, but it also leads me here to Idea City and to meet folks like you. And so a few of the things I want to talk about with the oyster, and the oyster is a strange creature. It's unlike a fish. It has a huge heart. It doesn't have eyes. It doesn't look back at you. It doesn't struggle when you shuck it. But the one thing that it does demand of you is that you care about the oyster. And you have to care about how it's presented. Because if it's not cared and treated with respect, it will stink like a fish. And it will not be a pleasant experience. And so throughout the age now, and the oyster has adorned the table of the rich and the poor for thousands of years. And to put the oyster into context in the sense of perfection, the oyster was perfect hundreds of millions of years ago, well before the whales made it into the water. The whales were still on land when the perfect little oyster, and the oyster hasn't changed in millions of years. So I take my cue. I want to be associated with something so, well, vaginal in appearance. It sustains me. I found my passion. And these are the qualities about an oyster. And an oyster, what I love about it is that it demands that you give it the attention. And to be an oyster farmer, it requires the extra work. To be an oyster purveyor, whether or not you're Rodney Clark or Oyster Boy or Starfish, there is professionalism. You have to have that extra touch. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have a great oyster experience. And this is what I love about challenging us in this day and age. I'm not just producing seafood. For me, from the first oyster that I grew and I sold, and by now it's millions of oysters that I grow and I fondle and I love every one of them. What I love about this whole world of the oyster is it's challenging me, but it's going to challenge all of us. Do we want to live in a world that is mediocre? Do we want to live in a world that doesn't care? Do we want to live in a world that is so status quo? And the difference between, in my opinion, the difference between that which is mediocre and that which is exceptional and that which is passion-filled, it just requires that extra 20%. And often, that is all it takes. And when all of us, it's not something that special, you have to find something that you love. You have to find something that you care about. And what I'd like to challenge all of us is to have this love affair with the oceans, with community, with the broader world, and that the love affair also is, where are we going into the future? And I hope none of us compromise on that when it comes to soul food, we never allow putting an oyster into a petri dish and let it grow without the heart and the soul.
Great ideas are meant to be shared. Join the discussion on Facebook. Moses Znaimer's Idea City Conference. Ideas change the world.
The perfect oyster for me is all about stretching the imagination. I'm an idealist, but I'm also quite a pessimist. And the world that I want to live in is one where I want to live towards enlightenment. I want to be in a world of where community and everybody are at their happiest. They're most content. They're most fulfilled. And by all means, that is something that will elude us forever. But the process, and it's the process towards the perfect oyster, where I'm constantly trying to grow it, I'm trying to market it, I'm trying to shuck it. And it requires that you give it that extra care. It requires that you give it that extra love. And I would say that if all of us, no matter what we are doing in life, if you take that simple act of caring and loving and respecting and throwing a bit of passion towards that which you find. For me, my muse is the oyster. For me, I've fallen in love with them. It's so removed from the world of how seafood is being harvested, how it's being treated. For the most part, the world of seafood right now is commodity. But the one thing I will not compromise on, and I hope none of us compromise on, that when it comes to soul food, we never allow putting an oyster into a petri dish and let it grow without the heart and the soul. All you have to do is support the farmers, support the fishermen, support your communities, and walk the talk. And the day that you do not have oysters in Toronto, and the day that you don't have oysters in the Gulf because of an oil spill, and you're eating spam or you're eating something out of a petri dish, be insulted, be angry, because you can do better than that. And on that note, what I'd like to suggest is that the potential that we all here have, in the spirit of making the world everybody's oyster, have a great day.
You know, I came across this thing. I thought you might touch on it, but it says, wild oyster reefs are thought by some experts to be the most severely impacted marine habitat on Earth.
The prairies, where agricultural farmland is the most altered. When it comes to the oceans, yes. Between 1850 and 1900, the oyster beds around the world were phenomenal. And this is where the city of New York, truly in 1850, everywhere you found oyster houses, you found oysters, because off of Staten Island you had oyster beds that were so huge. And so the stocks have been depleted greatly. The dream I have is that we can restore and we can humanly get back to that level of oyster stocks around the world that are back to the level of what they were back in the early 1800s. And you can do that when you have a population that is willing to buy them at a fair price, and fall in love with them. Nature is giving us a second chance, because you can't do it with timber, you can't do it with the fisheries, but with an oyster, you can grow an oyster in 2 to 3 years. And so that dream that I have of seeing the stocks around the world, and once we get back to these historic levels, then the idea of sequestering carbon, the ability to produce pearls en masse, the ability to feed humanity, and the oyster is truly got great potential, as all of you do as well.
Let me take a picture.
Idea City is a place where ideas come face to face to inspire and give us hope. At this time, our planet needs it most. Idea City is a place. Everybody sing. Where ideas come face to face to inspire and give us hope. At this time, our planet